The alien court chuckled as the mute servant was whipped, until a human janitor grabbed the whip. The grand court of the Vorin Empire was not a place built for comfort, it was built for power. The ceiling rose so high that the top of it disappeared into a soft golden haze, and the floor was made of pale stone, so smooth and cold, footsteps echoed like small cracks of thunder. The walls were lined with carvings, tall, proud figures of the Vorin, their forearms raised, their wide, flat faces turned upward as if they owned the sky itself. And in many ways, they did. The Vorin had ruled their corner of the galaxy for over 300 years. They had crushed 6 rebellions, absorbed 4 neighboring species into servitude, and signed treaties with 11 others. Treaties that always, somehow, ended up benefiting the Vorin more than anyone else. They were tall, gray-skinned, and slow-moving in the way that only truly confident creatures could afford to be. They had no reason to rush. The galaxy, as far as they were concerned, was already theirs. On the day this story begins, the Grand Court was full. Lords and ladies of the Vorin sat in rows of wide stone seats that curved around a central open floor like the inside of a bowl. Their robes were heavy and bright, deep purples, sharp golds, and reds so dark they looked almost black. Some wore jewels around their thick necks. Some carried small creatures on their laps, animals with soft fur and large eyes that purred when stroked. The air smelled of something sweet and artificial, pumped through vents in the ceiling to keep the nobles comfortable. At the center of that open floor, on his knees, was Dane. He was human, 26 years old, lean from too little food and too much work, with dark hair that had grown past his ears because no one had thought to offer him a cut. His knees, pressed against the cold stone, had long since grown calluses from exactly this position. He wore the gray uniform of a Vorin household servant, plain, without color, without decoration. Around his neck was a thin metal collar, smooth and silver, that connected him to the estate's tracking system. It did not hurt him. It simply reminded him every second of every day where he belonged, or where they believed he belonged. Dane had not always been here. He had been born on a small human settlement called Mora Station, out near the edge of explored space. His parents had worked in cargo logistics. He had grown up in a place that smelled like machine oil and instant noodles, and the particular kind of hope that comes from people who don't have much but refuse to stop trying. He had been 17 when a Vorin trading vessel made an unscheduled stop at Mora. He had been 19 when he woke up in a holding cell with a collar around his neck, and no memory of the 2 years in between. He had been a servant in the court of Lord Varric ever since. He did not speak, not because he had forgotten how, but because speaking had never helped. In the early days he had tried. He had explained himself, argued, asked questions, demanded answers. The Vorin had found this amusing for exactly 3 days. Then they had decided it was annoying. The collar had a secondary function, one that made speaking extremely unpleasant. After a while, Dane had simply stopped. Now he communicated in other ways: a nod, a tilt of the head, the careful positioning of objects to show he understood an instruction. He had become, in the eyes of the court, something close to furniture. Present, useful, beneath notice. That morning he had been moving through the hall carrying a tray of tall crystal goblets filled with a pale blue liquid that the Vorin lords drank before their formal sessions. It was an honor to serve this drink, or so the head servant had told him once. Dane had not felt honored. He had felt the weight of 6 full goblets, and the awareness that if he spilled even a drop, there would be consequences. He had not spilled anything. But Lord Varric's eldest son, a young Vorin named Pol, who had the personality of a creature that had never once been told no, had stretched his long arm out into the path of the tray as Dane passed. Whether it was deliberate or not was a question no one in that room would ever seriously consider. The tray tilted. 2 goblets hit the stone floor. The blue liquid spread in a wide, pale stain. The crystal shattered into small, bright pieces. The laughter began almost immediately. It was not the warm laughter of people who find something genuinely funny. It was the lazy laughter of people who are bored and have just been given something to look at. Clicks and low rumbles, and a sound like air escaping a pressurized container. That was how the Vorin laughed. It moved around the room like a wave, one section catching it from another, until the whole court was alive with it. Lord Varric did not laugh. He sat in his high seat at the far end of the room, and looked at the broken goblets and the spreading stain, and then at Dane, and his wide, flat face was completely still. Varric was old. Varric had ruled this estate for 40 years. He had learned that cruelty was most effective when delivered without emotion, the way a surgeon cuts, cleanly, without hesitation, without regret. He raised one hand and made a small gesture. He had seen it before. He knew what it meant. The court enforcer, a broad-shouldered Vorin who stood near the side wall during every formal session, unhooked the coiled whip from his belt. It was long and dark, made from something that was not leather, but behaved like it. It made a sound when it moved through the air that was different from any other sound in the room, a sound with weight to it. Dane did not run. There was nowhere to run. He did not plead. His collar made that pointless. He simply lowered his head a little further and waited, the way he had learned to wait, with his whole body still, and his mind somewhere else, back on Mora Station, in the kitchen of his parents' small quarters, watching his mother stir something on the stove, while his father told a bad joke, and laughed at it himself before he even reached the punchline. The laughter in the court had not stopped. If anything, it had grown. The whip uncoiled. Outside in the corridor, past the great gilded doors that stood half open to let in the processed air, a mop bucket scraped quietly against the floor. Slow, even footsteps moved along the stone passage. They did not hurry. They were the footsteps of someone who had no particular reason to hurry, who had learned through long experience that most things in a place like this were not his problem. The first crack of the whip rang through the hall. The footsteps outside stopped. There was a pause, brief, the length of a breath held and then released. And then the footsteps began again. But this time they were moving toward the doors. The alien court chuckled as the mute servant was whipped, until a human janitor grabbed the whip. Hero was not the kind of man people wrote songs about. He was 34 years old. His hair was cut short and practical. His hands were wide and rough from years of physical work. And there was a scar on his left palm from a maintenance accident involving a broken pipe on Deck 3 of the Yensu, the human diplomatic vessel he had called home for the past 6 years. He was not especially tall or especially strong. He did not have a background in combat or law or politics. His file, if anyone had bothered to pull it up, would have read, Janitorial and Maintenance Staff, Level 2 Clearance, no disciplinary record, rated satisfactory in all performance reviews. Satisfactory. That was the word that followed Kiro around. He did his job, he did it well, he did not cause problems, and he went to sleep at night without any particular sense of drama. He had been assigned to the Vorin Embassy as part of a human goodwill program, the idea being that having humans perform service roles in Vorin spaces demonstrated humility and respect, and would help smooth ongoing diplomatic negotiations. Kiro had not volunteered for this. He had been told he was going, and he had packed his cleaning supplies and gone, because that was the kind of man he was. He had been on Vorin grounds for 11 days. In those 11 days, He had cleaned 17 rooms, unclogged 2 waste processing units, replaced a filtration panel in the east corridor, and eaten his meals alone in the small room they had given him near the service entrance. He had not complained. He had not caused trouble. He had kept his head down and done his work, which was the advice Ambassador Ryo had given all the human staff before they disembarked. Keep your head down, be polite, do not touch anything you are not assigned to touch. Remember that you are guests here, and that the negotiations are more important than any individual discomfort. Kiro had thought about that word, discomfort. He had filed it away somewhere in the back of his mind and gone back to mopping. On the morning of the 11th day, he had been assigned to the corridor outside the Grand Court. It was a long corridor, stone-floored and cool, lit by panels in the wall that gave off a pale bluish light that Kiro had never quite gotten used to. The corridor smelled of that artificial sweetness the Vorin used everywhere, something floral that wasn't quite any flower Kiro could name. He had his bucket and his mop, and he was working his way from one end to the other in the steady, methodical way he did everything. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was thinking about whether the filtration panel he had replaced yesterday was going to hold, because the seal had looked a little worn, and he hadn't had the right replacement part, and had improvised with what he had. He was thinking about this in the comfortable background way that tradespeople think about ongoing problems. Not worried exactly, just aware. Then he heard the crack. It was loud. It cut through the walls and the door and the ambient noise of the corridor, like something sharp through something soft. Kiro's mop stopped moving. His hands tightened slightly on the handle. He stood still and listened. For a moment there was nothing, just the low hum of the building's systems and the faint distant sound of voices from inside the court. Then the second crack came, and with it, very clearly, laughter. Kiro set his mop against the wall. He did it slowly, carefully, the way he did things, making sure it wouldn't slide and fall. He looked at his hands. He looked at the doors at the end of the corridor, tall, gilded, standing half open. He thought about what Ambassador Ryo had said. He thought about the negotiations and the goodwill program and the word discomfort. He rolled up his left sleeve, then his right. He was not sure why he did this. It was something his father had done before any kind of difficult physical task, a habit Kiro had absorbed without noticing until he was already doing it. He walked toward the doors. He did not run. Running would have felt wrong, like he was acting on panic, and Kiro was not panicking. He was doing something much quieter and much more deliberate than panicking. He was making a decision that he had not technically made yet. He was simply walking and letting the decision arrive when his feet did. He pushed the doors open with both hands. The inside of the Grand Court was larger than he had expected. He had passed this corridor every day for 11 days, but had never been inside. Now he stood in the doorway and took it in. The high ceiling, the curved rows of alien nobility, the cold, pale stone, the smell of sweetness and something else underneath it, something metallic. 200 faces turned toward him. Eyes of varying colors, shapes, and configurations, all swung in his direction, with the kind of slow, unified movement that happens when something unexpected enters a room. At the center of the floor, on his knees, was a human. Kiro looked at him for exactly 1 second. He took in the gray uniform, the collar, the way the man held himself, shoulders drawn inward, head down, the posture of someone who had practiced making himself small. He took in the raised welt visible on the side of the man's neck, already darkening. He took in the enforcer standing above him with the whip still in hand, arm half raised, ready for another stroke. Then Kiro walked forward. His footsteps were loud in the sudden quiet. He walked across the open floor at the same pace he always walked, steady, unhurried, like a man crossing a room to fix something that needed fixing. The rows of Vorin nobles watched him. None of them moved. He suspected they were too surprised to move, or perhaps too curious. He was a small human male in a stained maintenance uniform, walking across the most powerful court in the Vorin Empire, as though he had been asked to check a pipe fitting. He stopped between the enforcer and the man on his knees. He turned to face the enforcer. The enforcer was a head taller than him and considerably wider. The whip hung from one large hand. The enforcer's flat face showed something that might have been confusion or might have been the Vorin version of amusement. Kiro had not yet learned to read their expressions well enough to be sure. Kiro held out his open hand, palm up. The court was silent. "Give me the whip," he said. His voice was calm, not aggressive, not loud, not shaking. It was the voice he used when he told a junior crew member that they had connected a coupling backwards and needed to redo it. Matter of fact, without drama, simply naming a thing that needed to happen. The words hung in the air of the Grand Court. Around them not a single noble moved, not a single one laughed now. The sweet artificial air cycled through the vents above. The pale stone floor reflected the bluish light, and Kiro stood with his hand out and waited, because he had asked for something, and he was a patient man. Behind him, very quietly, the man on his knees made a sound. Not a word. Something smaller than that. Something that had been held in for a very long time. Kiro did not look back. He kept his eyes on the enforcer and waited. The alien court chuckled as the mute servant was whipped, until a human janitor grabbed the whip. Lord Varric had ruled for 40 years. In that time, he had faced challenges from rival lords. He had navigated the deaths of 2 emperors and the transitions that followed. He had crushed one small rebellion on his eastern estates, with the kind of efficiency that other lords spoke about with quiet admiration at formal dinners. He had dealt with scheming advisors, dishonest merchants, and a nephew who had tried twice to have him poisoned. He had outlasted all of them. He sat in his high seat now with the stillness of a very old, very patient predator, and he watched the small human male standing in the center of his court with his hand out, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt curious. Not the polite curiosity of someone encountering something mildly interesting. Something sharper than that. Something that made him lean forward by a fraction, his wide flat eyes narrowing slightly, his 4 hands folding together in his lap. He had owned human servants before. He had seen humans frightened, humans obedient, humans broken by slow degrees into something that no longer resembled what they had started as. He had never seen a human walk into his grand court uninvited and ask for a whip. He had not yet decided what to do about it, and because he had not decided, no one else in the room moved either. That was the nature of power in a place like this. The Lord's uncertainty became everyone's uncertainty. His stillness became their stillness. The enforcer holding the whip looked toward Varric for instruction. Varric gave him nothing. Varric was watching. Kiro had his hand out and his eyes on the enforcer, and he was not, from the outside, doing anything that could be called threatening. But there was something in the way he was standing, something in the set of his shoulders and the steadiness of his gaze, that the enforcer, who dealt in physical intimidation every day of his professional life, recognized as a specific category of human behavior. The category was, this person has already decided. The enforcer had met very few people of any species who had already decided. It was an uncomfortable thing to be in front of. From the upper tier of the seating rows, a Vorin noblewoman leaned toward the lord beside her and made a quiet clicking sound, the Vorin equivalent of a whispered comment. The lord beside her made no response. He was watching too. At the back of the hall, near the far door, Hana pressed herself against the wall. She was the human diplomatic attaché assigned to the Vorin embassy. 29 years old, fluent in 3 alien languages, including Intermediate Vorin, and selected for this position specifically because she was good in difficult situations. She had been present in the court today for a routine observational session, sitting in the small section reserved for visiting diplomatic staff. She had been taking notes. She had watched the goblets fall, watched the enforcer step forward, watched the whip come out. All of this with the controlled, careful stillness of someone who knew that reacting visibly was not currently an option. Then Hiro had walked in. Her notes had stopped. She watched him now with an expression that mixed equal parts horror and something she could not immediately name. She had her comm unit in her hand, and she was pressing the channel for Ambassador Ryo. But her eyes did not leave Kiro's back. The channel connected. She heard Ryo's voice, calm and professional. "Attaché Hana, what is it?" She tried to explain what she was looking at. She was not sure she succeeded. Back at the center of the floor, Lord Varric finally spoke. His translator bead, a small device worn near the throat that all Vorin lords used in mixed-species settings, converted his words into flat, clear human speech. "You are a cleaning unit," he said. The phrase was not an insult exactly, in the way he delivered it. It was more like a statement of categorization, the kind of thing you might say to a machine that had wandered into the wrong room. "You have no standing in this court." Kiro did not lower his hand. "Neither does he said, nodding toward Dane. "And yet here we both are." There was a pause after this. A real one. Not the pause of shock, but the pause of something being processed by a large number of minds at once. Several nobles shifted in their seats. The creature on Pole's lap made a small sound, and was silently shushed. Lord Varric's expression did not change, but the fraction of forward lean increased very slightly. "You are aware," Varric said, with the patience of a very large creature explaining something to a very small one, "that what happens in this hall is not subject to the opinions of service personnel." "I'm aware," Kiro said. "I'm not offering an opinion." He kept his hand out. "I'm asking for the whip." Pole, Varric's eldest son, made a sound that in a younger, less controlled noble might have been a laugh. He covered it poorly. Several of his peers pretended not to notice. Varric did not look at his son. He continued to look at Kiro. "If I allow my enforcer to give you this object," Varric said slowly, "it will be interpreted by everyone in this room as an acknowledgement that you have some authority here, which you do not." "If your enforcer doesn't give me the object," Kiro replied, "he's going to have to go through me to use it, which he can probably do. But that's also going to be interpreted by everyone in this room as something." Another pause. Hana, in the back of the hall, had stopped breathing. Varric looked at the human male standing in the center of his court, in a stained uniform with his hand extended and his eyes level. He thought about what it would look like, the various ways it could look, and he processed these thoughts with the practiced speed of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where optics were everything. Then he made a small gesture toward the enforcer. Not the gesture for continuation. Wait! It was not agreement. It was not concession. It was something much more narrow, a pause. An insertion of time, while Varric decided what this was, and what it meant, and what it would cost him, in any of the several possible directions. Kiro let his hand drop slowly. He did not step back. He did not relax. He turned, carefully, and crouched down next to Dane. Dane had not moved from his knees. He was looking at the floor. Kiro got close enough to speak quietly, below the range of the translator beads, in plain, simple words. "Are you okay?" he asked. Dane looked up at him. His eyes were dark and very tired, and there was something in them that was not broken. Something that had simply been waiting, for a very long time, for something to look at besides the floor. He gave the smallest nod. "Okay," Kiro said. He stayed crouched. He was not going anywhere. In the back of the hall, Ambassador Rio came through the far door at a near run, adjusting his jacket as he moved. He scanned the room, found Hana, found Kiro, found the situation. He stopped, took one slow breath, and then walked forward, because that was what you did. The court watched two humans stand in the center of their hall, and did not, for the moment, laugh. Outside in the corridor, Kiro's mop leaned against the wall where he had left it. The water in the bucket had gone cold. The corridor was empty and quiet, lit by pale blue panels, smelling of that artificial sweetness. A small drop of blue liquid had dried at the base of the bucket, left over from when Kiro had last rinsed the mop head. It had not been cleaned properly. It would leave a mark on the floor if it was not dealt with. Kiro, inside the court, was not thinking about this. He would deal with it later. The alien court chuckled as the mute servant was whipped, until a human janitor grabbed the whip. Ambassador Rio was 51 years old and had spent the last 22 of those years in diplomatic service. He had negotiated trade agreements in 4 star systems. He had sat across tables from species who thought humans were primitive and species who thought humans were dangerous. And he had worked with both types until they signed something. He had once talked a Voran fleet commander out of a blockade using nothing but a cultural misunderstanding about the word territory, and an unexpected knowledge of Voran agricultural history. He was good at his job. He had a voice that was designed, either by nature or long practice, to sound like everything was going to be fine. He used that voice now. "Lord Varric," he said, crossing the open floor to stand beside Kiro, with the unhurried pace of a man who had planned to be here all along. "I apologize for the interruption to your session. We'd like to address the situation directly, if you'll permit it." Varric regarded Rio the way he had been regarding Kiro, with that particular quality of attention that was not yet decided. "Your cleaning unit interrupted my court," Varric said. "He did," Rio agreed. "He did not apologize for this. He moved carefully around it instead, the way you move around something fragile on a shelf, acknowledging it without touching it. I'd like to explain why, if I may, in terms that may be relevant to your lordship's interests." Varric's flat eyes moved to Kiro, then back to Rio. He made a gesture that meant proceed. Rio did not look at Kiro. He did not look at Dane. He kept his eyes on Varric, and spoke with the careful evenness of someone dismantling something complicated without letting any of the parts fall. He spoke about the Kellan Accords, which the Voran Empire had signed 4 cycles ago, a broad diplomatic framework that governed the treatment of sentient beings in interspecies territories. He spoke specifically about Article 9, Section 3, which addressed the physical treatment of nationals from signatory species while on the soil of other signatory states. He spoke about what that section required in terms of formal process before any corporal measure could be applied. He spoke about all of this for approximately 90 seconds, in complete sentences without notes. When he finished, the court was quiet. Varric said, "You memorized the accords." "My staff did," Rio said. And then, because honesty in the right moment is a diplomatic tool as much as any other, he added, "One member of my staff in particular, apparently." Varric looked at Kiro again. Kiro had not moved. He was still crouched near Dane, one knee on the cold stone, watching the conversation without expression. "Your cleaning unit memorized a diplomatic treaty," Varric said. It was not quite a question. "It was quiet on Deck 7 at night," Kiro said. Several nobles in the upper rows made sounds, not laughter, something adjacent to it, but different, drier. The sound of people absorbing something they did not have a ready category for. Varric sat back in his seat. He looked at the enforcer, who had stood with the whip for the last several minutes, with the slightly rigid quality of someone waiting for instruction that was taking longer than expected. Varric made a gesture, small, precise. The enforcer recoiled the whip and stepped back to his position by the wall. He did this without comment, because enforcers in Varric's court learned early that survival meant reading the Lord's gestures accurately and acting on them without delay. The whip went away. Rio let out a breath that no one would have noticed unless they were standing very close to him. Hana, still pressed against the back wall, noticed it. Kiro stood up. He straightened slowly, the way people straighten when their knee has been on cold stone for longer than it should have been. And he looked at Dane and said quietly, "Can you stand?" Dane looked up at him. He put one hand on the floor and pushed himself upright. He was shaky. The adrenaline, Kiro guessed, or possibly just the simple shock of something changing in a situation that had been unchanged for years. Kiro put a hand on his arm to steady him, not in a dramatic way, just a practical one. The same way he would steady a heavy panel that was about to slide. Article 9 also covers immediate medical assessment, Rio said to Varric, not missing the moment. With your lordship's permission, I'd like our medical attaché to see to this man. Varric said nothing for a moment. Then, your people are thorough. We try to be, my lord. Another pause. Varric looked around his court, at the rows of his nobles, at his son Pol, who had the expression of a young lord who is watching something happen that he does not yet understand, but suspects he should have prevented. Varric thought about what his court had just watched. He thought about what they would say among themselves afterward, in private rooms and over formal meals. He thought about what it looked like, not just the intervention, but the specific shape of it. A human janitor, with no weapons and no authority, had walked into his court and stopped a punishment by citing a treaty his own diplomatic staff had apparently not thought to cite. He thought about what it meant that the human who had done this was not a soldier, or a lawyer, or a lord. He thought about what it meant that the human was a cleaning unit who had read treaty documents in his spare time because the nights were quiet. He did not reach a conclusion, not yet. But something shifted in the quality of his attention, some adjustment behind his flat eyes, some recalibration that he did not show and would not name. "Take your people," he said to Rio. "We will discuss the matter of the accords in formal session tomorrow." Rio gave a formal incline of the head, not a bow, which would have been too much, not nothing, which would have been an insult. "Thank you, my lord." They moved toward the door, Rio first, then Kiro with a hand still on Dane's arm, then Hana detaching herself from the back wall and falling in behind them. Their footsteps crossed the pale stone floor of the grand court. 200 Vorin nobles watched them go. No one spoke. No one laughed. At the doors, Kiro paused. He could not have said why. He turned slightly and looked back at the court, at the wide curved rows, and the high hazy ceiling, and the place on the floor where the spilled blue liquid had already been cleaned away by another servant during the commotion. He looked at the empty center of the floor, where Dane had been kneeling. He looked at Lord Varric in his high seat, who was watching him back with those flat, careful eyes. Kiro held the gaze for 1 second. Then he turned and walked through the door. In the corridor, his mop was where he had left it. The water in the bucket had gone cold. He picked up the mop, looked at it for a moment, and then handed it to a passing Vorin maintenance worker, with a gesture that meant, "This corridor is done, if someone could finish the far end." The Vorin maintenance worker took the mop, with an expression of total confusion, and stood holding it, as Kiro walked away down the corridor, with Dane and Rio and Hana, toward the human medical station. Dane walked in silence. He had not spoken. The collar was still on, and speaking still cost him. But he walked upright, without the inward curve of his shoulders, and his eyes were moving around the corridor with the particular quality of someone who is noticing things again, after a very long time of keeping their gaze on the floor. He looked at the wall panels. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the side of Kiro's face. Kiro noticed and said nothing. He just kept walking. Ryo, on the other side of Dane, spoke quietly. That was either the best thing that's happened this week, or the worst. I genuinely haven't decided yet. It was the right thing, Kiro said. The other two can wait. Ryo looked at him. He thought about 22 years of diplomatic service, and all the things he had learned about how power worked, and how situations were managed, and how people in service positions were supposed to behave in places like this. He thought about a cleaning unit who had memorized a treaty in the quiet of a night shift. Yes, he said. I suppose it was. The alien court chuckled as the mute servant was whipped, until a human janitor grabbed the whip. The medical station was a small room near the service entrance of the human diplomatic quarters. 3 cots, a cabinet of supplies, and a light that was warmer than the bluish Voron panels, and felt, in contrast, almost aggressively human. Dane sat on one of the cots, while Hana cleaned and dressed the welt on his neck, and a second mark on his shoulder that none of them had noticed through the uniform until now. Hana worked without talking. She had talked enough in her life, and she understood that this was not a moment for words. She worked carefully and gently, and Dane sat very still and watched her hands. He had the expression of someone who has been unexpectedly treated with care, and is not sure whether it is real yet, and is afraid to respond to it, in case it disappears. Ambassador Ryo sat in a chair against the wall and watched Kiro file his incident report on a small handheld unit. Kiro filled in every field. He had a precise memory for details, times, sequence of events, specific language used, physical descriptions of marks and injuries. He had filled in maintenance incident reports for 12 years, and the discipline of it transferred directly. When he was done, he read it back once, made 2 small corrections, and submitted it to the ship's legal officer. That report will go to the Human Diplomatic Authority, Ryo said, and from there to the Kellan Accord's oversight body. I know, Kiro said. This isn't going away quietly. It shouldn't, Kiro said. Then he looked at Dane, who was watching Hana reseal the medical kit with the careful, quiet attention of someone learning that ordinary objects can be used with gentleness. Ryo thought about the negotiations he had been building for 8 months. He thought about the Voron lords and their long memories and their pride. He thought about the formal session that Varric had agreed to for tomorrow, which would now have to address the Kellan Accords in a way it had never been forced to address them before. In a court full of nobles who had watched a janitor walk in and stop a punishment. He thought about all the ways this could complicate things. Then he thought about Dane on his knees on that cold stone floor, and the way the room had laughed. Right, Ryo said, and he stood up and went to make tea, because he had learned over 22 years that hot drinks after difficult things were not a small gesture, but a necessary one, and he had a small portable unit in his quarters that produced something close enough to the real thing. The formal session the next day lasted 4 hours. Lord Varric was present. His senior advisor was present. The Voron Empire's legal consultant, a thin, fast-talking creature who had spent decades finding spaces between treaty clauses, was present. On the human side, Ryo was present, with Hana beside him, and a legal officer named Baum, who had pulled the Kellan Accords apart and put them back together so many times he could cite individual paragraphs in his sleep. Kiro was not present. He had been asked if he wanted to attend. He had said no. He was not a diplomat, and he did not need to watch people argue about things he had already settled in his own mind before he walked through those doors. He was cleaning the east corridor, which had been neglected, while the filtration panel he had improvised 3 days ago was finally getting its proper replacement part installed. Improvised fixes never sat quite right. The The session ended with an amendment to the standing agreement between the Vorin estate and the human diplomatic presence, one that formally acknowledged the Kellen Accord's provisions, required documented process for any disciplinary measure involving a human national, and established a review for the status of all current human servants on Vorin estate grounds. It was not everything. It was not the full end of something, but it was a door pushed open that had previously been sealed. Baum sent Kiro a message after the session. It said, "They asked who briefed you on the Accords. I told them no one. They asked how you knew about Article 9, Section 3 specifically. I told them you read." The room was quiet for a while after that. Kiro read the message, set his unit down, and went back to fitting the replacement seal. Dane's collar was removed 6 days later. The process was quieter than Dane had expected. A Vorin technician came to the small room near the service quarters where Dane had been staying since the incident, carrying a small tool and a data unit. The technician did the work in under 3 minutes, without speaking. The collar came away in 2 pieces. The technician collected them, noted something on the data unit, and left. Dane sat on the edge of the cot for a long time after that. The skin under the collar was lighter than the skin around it, a pale strip where the metal had sat for years, shielding that part of him from light. He touched it with 2 fingers and felt the difference in temperature. Warmer, his own warmth, no longer blocked. He had not spoken since before he could remember. Not because he couldn't, because the cost had always been too high and the audience had always been wrong. He sat in the small room and thought about this for a while. Then he said out loud to no one, "Okay." His voice was rough from disuse. It sounded strange to him, like hearing a recording of yourself and not quite recognizing it. But it was there. It worked. He said it again just to confirm. "Okay." He got up and went looking for Kiro. He found him in the east corridor, on his knees beside a panel fitting, tightening a seal with a small handheld driver. Kiro looked up when Dane approached. Dane stood in the corridor under the pale blue lights and looked at Kiro with those tired, dark eyes that now had something new in them. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the early shape of something that could grow into happiness if given time and enough of the ordinary things. Dane said, "Thank you." Kiro looked at him for a moment. Then he went back to the seal, because it was almost tight but not quite. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know," Dane said. "I want to." Kiro finished tightening the seal. He sat back and looked at it. It was good. It was going to hold. He said, "Are you hungry? There's a food unit in the staff room. The coffee is bad, but it's hot." Dane said, "Yes." So they went. Months later, in the records of 17 alien governments, analysts reviewed the incident that had come to be called, in various translation equivalents, the court interruption, or the janitor affair, or simply the human event. It was studied not as a diplomatic crisis, but as a data point, a small specific instance that carried implications larger than its immediate size. The analysis reached different conclusions depending on who was doing the analyzing. The Vorin internal review focused on the procedural gaps that had allowed a low-status individual to disrupt a formal session, and recommended additional screening protocols for human service personnel. The Kalen Accord's oversight body used it as a test case for enforcement mechanisms that had, until then, existed mostly on paper. Several smaller species with human diplomatic contacts filed requests for briefings on the Accord's provisions that they had previously not bothered to read closely. But there was one analysis, conducted by a species called the Selhari, who were quiet, methodical, and very good at pattern recognition, that went further. The Selhari report noted that what was unusual about the incident was not the outcome. The outcome, a treaty being invoked, a practice being challenged, a formal session resulting in amendment, was entirely normal diplomatic process. What was unusual was the initiating agent. The Selhari report spent 11 pages on this. The human who had entered the court held no formal authority. He was not a legal officer, or a diplomat, or a soldier. He had no mandate from his government, and no instruction from his superior. He had not been asked, either by the victim of the punishment, or by anyone in his chain of command. He had heard a sound he did not like, made a decision, and acted. The Selhari analysis noted that most species, when faced with a situation beyond their formal role, performed a calculation. Can I act? Do I have the authority? What is the risk? This calculation often produced inaction, because in most hierarchical systems, the absence of explicit authority was sufficient reason to stand aside. The Selhari had observed this across dozens of species. It was, their report noted, a natural and in many ways reasonable response to hierarchical social structures. The human had performed a different calculation. He had not asked whether he could act. He had asked whether he should. And once that question was answered, once he had determined that what was happening in that room was wrong, and that he was present and capable of doing something about it, the absence of formal authority had not been a relevant factor. The Selhari report concluded, this is either an individual anomaly or a species pattern. Further data collection is recommended. The report was filed. The data collection began. Kiro spent another 3 months on the Vorin grounds before his assignment ended. He replaced 2 more filtration panels, repaired a waste processing unit in the lower staff quarters, and fixed a door hinge in the small diplomatic library that had been squeaking for as long as anyone could remember. He did his work. He kept his head up, because he had never agreed with the instruction to keep it down. He caused no further interruptions to formal court sessions, because none were required. On the day he left, Dane was at the service entrance. Dane had been reassigned to the human diplomatic staff, not as a servant, but as a support worker, a distinction that mattered in ways both practical and otherwise. He was learning to talk again, slowly, finding his way back into the shape of language through small conversations with Hana and Baum and occasionally Rio. His voice still sounded strange to him. He was getting used to it. They did not hug. They were not that kind of people. Or perhaps they were not yet. There was not enough shared time for it yet. Only shared experience, which is a different thing. Dane held out his hand. Kiro shook it. Try to read something useful on the trip back, Dane said. Kiro looked at him. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. I've got the Selhari Cooperative Statutes downloaded, he said. Deck transit is quiet. Dane nodded. Good, he said. Kiro picked up his bag. One bag, not large, neatly packed, and walked out through the service entrance and across the Vorin grounds to the transport dock. He passed the east corridor on the way, out of a slightly longer route than necessary, and checked the panel fitting as he went by. The seal was holding. He had known it would. He walked to the dock, boarded the shuttle, found a seat, and opened his reading. Outside the window, the Vorin grounds grew smaller and then disappeared, and the stars came in. Kiro read. The transit was quiet. It was enough.